Okay, the last keynote of today is entitled Transition in the TLS Protocol to Post-Quantum Cryptography. The keynote talk will be given by Dr. Douglas Stebila, who currently is an associate professor of cryptography in the Department of Combinatorics and Optimization at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. His research focuses on improving the security of key exchange protocols and internet cryptography protocols such as TLS and SSH, including the development of quantum-resistant solutions. He's also the leader of the Open Quantum Safe project, an open source software project for prototyping and evaluating quantum-resistant cryptography. He holds a master's degree from the University of Oxford and a PhD from the University of Waterloo, and held previous academic appointments at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia, and McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. So I would like to thank you, first of all, Dr. Douglas Stebila, for being here and for giving this keynote. And I guess we can start.
Thanks very much, Eleonora. And thanks, Mark and Mauro, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you today. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the various directions that we have to transition one of the most important internet protocols, TLS, to use post-quantum cryptography. So as you know, when you're on your favorite website, it is hopefully secured with a lock icon. And when you drill down into the details, you see a variety of cryptographic algorithms being used to protect this website. And KEMTLS is a well-configured website, so it's using some pretty good cryptography. When we look at the details, we see generally two classes of cryptographic algorithms used. We have public key cryptography, which is used during the connection establishment, and we have symmetric cryptography that's used to protect the actual application data. My focus today will be on the handshake that is used to establish the connection using public key cryptography. So in the TLS 1.3 handshake, we see two main algorithms being used, and indeed on the KEMTLS website as well, Diffie-Hellman key exchange and RSA signatures for authentication. So, looking at a high-level view of TLS 1.3, it's using a signed Diffie-Hellman key exchange with message authentication codes for confirmation, and then switching over to authenticated encryption for transmitting application data. So some of the key cryptographic components for us are the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. In this case, the client and server send each other ephemeral Diffie-Hellman public keys and establish a shared Diffie-Hellman secret. And ideally, they use these keys only once with new values in each session. And then in this version of the protocol that I'm showing you here, we have server to client authentication based on digital signatures. So the server has a long-term signature public key for which it has a certificate, and it transmits the certificate to the client, as well as a signature of the transcript communication. And then after all of that has been done, we can switch over to using authenticated encryption to protect our application data being keyed based on the Diffie-Hellman shared secret. So those are the core building blocks in our TLS connection establishment, the TLS 1.3 handshake. But the motivation for this talk is that the cryptographic assumptions used in the public key primitives in the handshake are not resistant to attack by quantum computers. RSA signatures are based on the difficulty of factoring, and Diffie-Hellman key exchange is based on the difficulty of computing discrete logarithms. And there exists a quantum algorithm that can solve both of these problems in polynomial time. So that motivates the field of post-quantum cryptography, sometimes called quantum-resistant algorithms, the design of cryptography that's believed to be resistant to attack by quantum computers, but importantly, uses only classical non-quantum operations to implement. So we can run this on a computer today, but hopefully it will be secure against attack by a future quantum computer. And there are now recognized to be 5 main families of post-quantum algorithms. We can build signature schemes from hash functions and symmetric primitives. That's the first family, and dates back to the earliest days of public key cryptography. We can also build signature schemes from multivariate quadratic systems of equations. And we can build key exchange protocols from assumptions on error correcting codes, like the McLeish system, which again dates back to the 70s, as well as lattice-based assumptions, and the newest post-quantum family, supersingular isogenies between elliptic curves. So we have several candidates for building post-quantum cryptography, and a standardization project is well underway to select some of these for widespread use. In 2016, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, in the United States, issued a call for post-quantum proposals with a deadline of November 2017. And for this first round, they received 69 submissions, about 1/3 of which were signature schemes, and 2/3 of public key encryption schemes. After about a year and a half, they narrowed it down to a second round of algorithms, 26 schemes, again, roughly 1/3 signatures and 2/3 public key encryption schemes. After about another year and a half of public review and comment, they've narrowed it down to round 3, which we are currently in, where there are 7 finalists and 8 alternate candidates. NIST has indicated that they intend to make an announcement about the end of round 3 sometime in the next couple of months, with the goal of developing a draft standard for some of the finalists by 2022 or 2023, and a final standard hopefully in 2024. And they've also indicated their intention to have an ongoing process and reopen something that's probably going to be called round 4 to solicit new signature schemes, as well as continue considering some of the alternate candidates. If you're not too familiar with the finalist and alternate candidates, I've listed them here. On the finalist slides, there are a few key encapsulation mechanisms, which kind of serve as a generalization of Diffie-Hellman key exchange. There's 1 based on error correcting codes and 3 based on lattices. And so far, NIST has indicated they intend to standardize at most one of the lattice-based candidates. Similarly, on the signature side, there's a couple of lattice-based candidates that they plan to standardize at most one of, as well as an alternative scheme based on multivariate. And then there are a few alternate candidates as well, which are perhaps not as mature or have some different trade-offs or are worthy of more consideration that are continuing to be explored. So with all of these options available to us, you might think that building post-quantum TLS is pretty straightforward. We take our TLS 1.3 handshake and we just scribble post-quantum all over it. We replace our signature scheme with a post-quantum signature scheme, and replace our Diffie-Hellman key exchange with a post-quantum key exchange based on one of our key encapsulation mechanisms. And then we'd be done, and this would be a very short keynote talk. But actually, there's more to it than that. There are several reasons why it's not going to be quite as straightforward transition as just scribbling on the diagram as I've shown here. And I'll go over a few of those reasons on the next few slides. So one of the reasons is that we have more trade-offs among our post-quantum algorithms. So when we look at a new algorithm, we'd like to be confident in its security, confident that it resists attacks by quantum computers. We'd like it to be very fast to compute, and we'd like to have very small communication sizes. We've been spoiled for the past decade or more with elliptic curve cryptography, especially, which has become very, very fast to compute for public key cryptography, and also has extremely small communication sizes. But unfortunately, our post-quantum algorithms do not meet all 3 of these criteria simultaneously. When we look among the various candidates available to us, you can generally pick at most 2 of these properties. For example, if we look at some of the key encapsulation mechanisms that are in the round 3 of NIST competition, I've shown here on the left-hand side the public key and ciphertext sizes of our post-quantum candidates at the top, the 3 lattice algorithms, Sabre, Enshu, and Kyber, followed by the code-based encryption scheme McLeish, and compared that with our traditional algorithms, elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman, and RSA. And you can see that in all cases, we generally have communication sizes larger than what we're used to. Everything is bigger than elliptic curves, and for our lattice algorithms, we're not gigantic, but we're in the 600 to 700 to 800 byte range, quite a bit larger than what we're used to with ECDH and RSA. And with classic McLeish, we observe an interesting trade-off. we have pretty small ciphertext, 128 bytes, on the order of RSA or smaller, but at the cost of having very large public keys, 260 kilobytes. So quite an extreme trade-off there. If we look at the computation times, we do see that our post-quantum algorithms behave pretty computationally efficiently, on the same order of magnitude in general as our existing algorithms. The y-axis here is in milliseconds. So the top is 4 milliseconds. You can see for almost all our post-quantum algorithms, all of their operations are in the sub-millisecond range here. Classic McLeese is a little bit slower on keygen, but still, well below a single second and even below a tenth of a second. So the performance is not necessarily too bad here, but we are seeing communication sizes that are larger than we're used to. And we see the same pattern when we look at signature schemes. Here are our signature finalists. And again, our lattice-based signature finalists are not gigantic, but again, larger than we're used to. And with the other signature finalist rainbow, we again see this trade-off exhibited between large public key and small signature size. And the performance situation is fairly similar as well. By and large, on the same order of magnitude, although in some cases a little bit slower, but still, well below the 1 second or even tenth of a second range. So we do have some constraints here around communication sizes, and that's one of the reasons that post-quantum cryptography is not an immediate drop-in replacement. It's also going to take some time to standardize and adopt post-quantum cryptography. So if we look at all of the things that need to be in place for TLS, post-quantum TLS, to be adopted, there are many actors, and they have to kind of work somewhat sequentially. So NIST, I've already mentioned the NIST timeline with its round 3 selection coming soon, hopefully leading to a draft standard, and then around 2024, a FIPS standard. Before the TLS working group is willing to take new algorithms into TLS, they require that it be approved by the Crypto Forum Research Group, CFRG, a sister working group to TLS. And that's only going to start its work after NIST round 3 has identified its selection. And that'll be probably a long process as well. And after that's done, then TLS can standardize. Now these can start beginning in parallel, so they can develop drafts, but we won't probably see the standards finalized until this sequence has happened. Implementers have already started with some early prototypes, and within the next couple of years, we'll probably start to see some more widespread preliminary adoption, but we won't see standards again, adoption of standardized versions until much later. And especially for some organizations that depend on FIPS certification for the products they use, it may be quite a while until we see FIPS certified implementations available for adoption. In the web space, we'll also need certificate authorities to come on board and be able to issue post-quantum certificates. And so the CA Browser Forum will need to develop guidelines, and certificate authorities will have to start deploying new certificates, as well as system operators will have to start getting those new certificates into their software. So lots of things to be done in order to get to the end goal of users using post-quantum cryptography in TLS. And I should actually say there are several things that post-quantum TLS really could be. We could be focusing on the key exchange aspect. We could try to replace the classical algorithm, solely the classical key exchange algorithm, Diffie-Hellman, with a post-quantum key exchange. Or we could be talking about combining a classical key exchange with a post-quantum key exchange. We also could be doing the same in the signature side, and we could be considering these steps independently. We also could be looking at alternative protocol designs. Now, on the key exchange front, post-quantum key exchange, replacing Diffie-Hellman with a post-quantum algorithm, is probably the easiest to implement because it can be done fairly unilaterally If a browser is ready to do it, then they can do it, and it can be done in a backwards compatible way. So a browser that is willing to support both post-quantum and traditional Diffie-Hellman key exchange can have both of those available, and just negotiate whatever works with servers that may or may not have been updated yet. And one could argue that this is actually the highest priority for post-quantum TLS at this point. Key exchange is what gives us confidentiality, and we do have to be worried about what are called harvest and decrypt attacks, where someone records today's classical communication and then hopes to decrypt it in the future once a quantum computer is available. And we might have information that we want to be confidential in this long term, and so replacing confidentiality measures with post-quantum equivalence is our highest priority. So I expect that we'll see post-quantum key exchange or classical plus post-quantum key exchange as some of the earliest post-quantum TLS work that's adopted. The second option, classical post-quantum plus post-quantum key exchange, is easy to implement as well. And I think it might be in demand, especially during this transition period before all the certifications are in place. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the talk. The next thing that could be considered post-quantum TLS is using post-quantum signatures. This is a little bit harder to realize, not because it's any harder to implement necessarily in software, but requires a lot more coordination because we need to have certificate authorities that are willing to issue post-quantum certificates, and we have to have system operators start deploying those post-quantum certificates. But fortunately, there's less urgency, in my opinion, for developing post-quantum authentication in TLS. And this is because a quantum computer can't retroactively break channel authentication. Authentication in TLS only needs to be secure up until the time of connection establishment. So a quantum computer in 20 years can't retroactively affect the authentication of TLS sessions today. Post-quantum signatures might be more important in areas that have long-term authentication requirements, such as document signing or digital contracts. But for a channel establishment, it's perhaps a lower authority. You could also consider combined classical and post-quantum signatures, what are called hybrid or composite signatures. Although I'd argue that that doesn't make too much sense in the context of a negotiated protocol like TLS. And this is because the parties can negotiate which algorithm they want to use for authentication at the time of connection establishment. So this combined with the non-retroactive break means that it may not make sense to have these type of certificates in the TLS context, although they might be useful elsewhere. We could also be considering alternative protocol designs where we re-envision what a post-quantum secure channel establishment protocol looks like. That's not just signed key exchange, but it could have something else. And I'll talk about some designs for this. But I will caution that these are harder to implement. They require more changes in the software, a new state machine for TLS, for example, or new architecture changes to be able to deploy new types of credentials. But it is worth considering because there may be benefits from these alternative protocol designs. So the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on two of these issues, the second and the fifth one here. So I'll have a bit of a discussion on hybrid, classical, and post-quantum key exchange, and also talk about some alternative protocol designs, one that we've been developing called KEMTLS. We have been investigating some of the other aspects in the transition to post-quantum TLS, and for that, I'll point you, there are a lot of resources out there, but one of the resources is an open source software project that we've been developing over the past few years called Open Quantum Safe. That has a variety of software for prototyping quantum resistant cryptography. So we have prototype implementations of classical and post-quantum combined or standalone post-quantum key exchange and authentication in a variety of protocols, TLS, SSH, as well as toolkits available in a variety of languages. So if you do want to play around with that, please feel free to take a look at some of these resources here. But in the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on hybrid key exchange and alternative protocol designs. So first off, hybrid or classical plus post-quantum key exchange. What I'm talking about here is based in part on joint work on an internet draft with Scott Fleur and Shai Garon. So the idea here is to use two algorithms simultaneously to hopefully improve some characteristic. Now, why would we want to do that? In this context, we're hoping for one of three things to happen. We might use two algorithms or two or more algorithms to reduce the risk to our security from the break of one algorithm. We could also be trying to ease the transition with some kind of improved backwards compatibility, or we could be trying to maintain some level of standards compliance during a transition. So on reducing the risk from the break of one algorithm, by using two or more algorithms, we get several properties. We enable early adopters to get post-quantum security without abandoning the security of their existing algorithms. So they could be trying to be proactive, but they're stepping into an unknown area and they don't want to make a wrong step, or at least they don't want to be worse off than if they hadn't done anything at all. And using two or more algorithms can reduce that risk. The goal would be to retain security as long as at least one of the algorithms we're using is unbroken. And this can help to reduce uncertainty on several aspects. We have uncertainty regarding the long-term security of our existing cryptographic assumptions because of the threat of quantum computers. But the transition also introduces uncertainty because we're using newer cryptographic assumptions. So using two or more algorithms can reduce the risk and reduce our uncertainty. It could also be helping ease the transition with improved backwards compatibility. This is because we might be able to design backwards compatible protocols or backwards compatible data structures that combine old algorithms and new algorithms in a way that systems that haven't been upgraded can still use the old algorithms, but new implementations that do recognize the new algorithms can use those instead. In some cases, this is necessary, although it may not be quite as necessary for negotiated protocols like TLS. So I don't think number 2 plays a huge role in TLS, but 1 and 3 do. The third one is standards compliance during transition. As I said, early adopters might want to start using post-quantum algorithms to reduce their exposure to certain types of risks, but they may also have standards obligations on them. They may be required to use certified implementations. For example, US government customers are required to use FIPS certified implementations, and they might want to start this transition before FIPS certified implementations of post-quantum algorithms are available. Fortunately, there are FIPS certified ways to combine keying material from two algorithms, from a FIPS certified implementation and a non-certified implementation that provides keying material in a way that preserves overall certification. What I'm trying to say here is that if you had a FIPS certified implementation that used existing algorithms like signed Diffie-Hellman, and you added, say, post-quantum key exchange to it, and combine that with your FIPS certified Diffie-Hellman, there are ways in which that would be allowed under the compliance regime. So that's another reason why we might want to use 2 or more algorithms. So that's motivating for this. I'll tell you now how we would actually try to do that in TLS 1.3. Before I do, a little bit of terminology. There are several different pieces of terminology and some with unfortunate connotations. Some people use the term hybrid, and that's the term that I'm using in the rest of this talk here to refer to the use of 2 algorithms together. Unfortunately, there's also another use of hybrid in cryptography, combining public key and symmetric encapsulation mechanisms to create a hybrid public key encryption scheme. So that term is a bit overloaded. And for that reason, some people prefer composite or dual algorithms. In the literature, there's also the term robust combiner, which kind of specifically refers to mechanisms for combining keying material. But I'll be using hybrid in the rest of this talk. So in this internet draft that we have before the working group, our goal is to define hybrid key exchange in TLS 1.3. So this means defining the data structures that are needed to negotiate, communicate, and do shared secret calculation for hybrid key exchange. But to be clear, this is focused on the mechanisms for hybrid key exchange, but there are things that are out of scope. So we're not trying to do anything with digital signatures. To define hybrid or composite signatures is not a goal of this work. And it's also not a goal of this work to select which post-quantum algorithms are meant to be used in TLS. I outlined earlier the various bodies that will be making those decisions. The goal here is to have everything ready once those algorithms are selected. So we considered several options on how to do this. It may seem like a straightforward thing, but there are actually engineering considerations in to make this work well in the TLS protocol. And the main idea of what we've come up with is that each desired combination of a traditional and post-quantum algorithm will be given a new key exchange identifier. So TLS calls its key exchange methods groups, because for now they're all Diffie-Hellman key exchanges. And when you want a particular post-quantum combination, it will have to be standardized as a new group. So there will be a new group specifically for X25519 plus, say, Kyber level 512. Okay? And you would have to standardize a new combination for each desired pairing. And then several engineering consequences follow from that on how we negotiate these combinations. We can use TLS's existing negotiation mechanism just with these new identifiers. As for conveying the public key and ciphertext values, this will be done by simply concatenating these values into a single value. So no creative protocol re-engineering required. We just plug these values right in. Perhaps the interesting aspect is the shared secret calculation. And in this case, we're concatenating the two shared secrets together, and we'll use that as an input to the key schedule. This might seem like a natural choice, but there are a few other options that I'll talk about on the next slide. As we were developing this, we did consider several other options, and each of these had some debate. So there is debate in the community on whether you should be designing mechanisms that focus on combining two algorithms or combining two or more algorithms. Some people do want to use 3, 4, 5 algorithms together to really mitigate the risk of algorithm break in the face of uncertain new cryptographic assumptions. However, allowing for 3, 4, 5 algorithms increases complexity as well. So for this design, we focused on just combining two algorithms. There are a variety of other engineering aspects, like how you negotiate which pairs of algorithms. For example, should you allow the individual algorithms to be separately negotiated, or should you negotiate them only as pairs? There are reasons to go both ways. In this case, we've gone for simplicity. You negotiate a single pair at a time to avoid having to develop logic in the implementation that avoids bad combinations. There are several aspects on how you might want to communicate the key shares. We've chosen one that is simpler, but does have some duplication of communication. But this is the direction that the working group wanted to go with, simpler. As I said, the most interesting thing for a cryptographer might be how we should combine these shared secrets. We have two shared secrets, a classical one and a post-quantum one. How should we combine these together into a single piece of keying material? Well, you could apply some kind of key derivation function before inserting it into some spot in the TLS key schedule. And the key derivation function that we're using in this case is simple concatenation. Alternatively, you could choose to XOR the keys together, or there are several components to the TLS key schedule, and you could insert into different parts of the TLS key schedule. And each of these has some trade-offs. We've gone with one that allows for a modular approach in that you don't have to change other parts of the TLS implementation. And that simplifies implementation. But it is worth checking whether this is a secure way of combining key material. Can we just combine keys by concatenating them and declare this to be a secure shared secret? Well, it's perhaps slightly better to think of it as hashing and concatenating and try to argue about the security of that. And that is actually what's going on in the key schedule. There is a hash being applied during the key schedule, so we'll think of it as concatenating and then hashing. Now, one important motivating factor is that concatenation is the primary method that NIST has approved for hybridization. I spoke earlier about wanting to maintain FIPS compliance, and NIST has a document that talks about how to combine keying material from approved and non-approved implementations, and concatenation is the primary one that they recommend. So if we're able to make this work and to do it in a way that we're confident with as cryptographers, then this also has the benefit of making standards compliant adoption work as well. So what we want to do to check the security of this is that assume that at least one of the two keys is good, indistinguishable from random, and then argue that the resulting shared secret, the hash of K1 concatenated of K2, is also indistinguishable from random. And you can do this very simple with idealized assumptions on the hash function. So if the hash function is a random oracle, then it's very easy to show the shared secret is also indistinguishable from random. If you don't want to make a random oracle assumption, then you can do so with a standard assumption. For example, if K1 and K2 are fixed length keys, and the hash function is modeled as a dual pseudo-random function, which means that it is a pseudo-random function in either of its two inputs, then you can also prove that the shared secret is indistinguishable from random. There hasn't been a whole lot of analysis of whether hash functions like SHA-2 or key derivation functions like HMAC satisfy the dual PRF assumption, so that is worth revisiting and reconsidering. But this whole motivation for this work is asking what happens if one of our cryptographic algorithms, in this case Diffie-Hellman key exchange, is risky and potentially attackable. But it is worth thinking about what if Diffie-Hellman isn't the only risky primitive. And so earlier this year, a group of researchers from ETH Zurich, Avraham et al., asked the question, what if the hash function in TLS 1.3 isn't collision resistant? And this isn't necessarily a post-quantum question because we don't have a specifically strong threat by quantum computers to hash functions beyond that what we have from Shor's algorithm. Sorry, than we have from Grover's algorithm. We don't have an exponential speed up from quantum computers in breaking hash functions. But it is a reasonable question to ask that there could be other cryptanalytic breakthroughs on hash function collision resistance. We know that MD5 and SHA-1 have already had their collision resistance broken. And in fact, that's been broken before any of the other security properties. So it's worth considering what happens in TLS and in hybrid key exchange if the hash function isn't collision resistant. Now, there are general problems in TLS 1.3 that happen if the hash function isn't collision resistant, that are related to how transcripts are hashed and how this affects authentication and session matching. That's independent of whether we switch to hybrid key exchange or post-quantum key exchange. So I'm going to kind of leave that out of scope at the moment, but we'll look at the question of what happens to hybrid shared secret calculation. If we have a non-collision resistant hash function, is concatenation and hashing a secure method of shared secret calculation? And Avraham and his colleagues pointed out that there are cases where this is not true. So if the hash function is not collision resistant, and more specifically, if hash function collisions can be found within the lifetime of a TLS session, and the first piece of keying material, K1, is adversary controlled and variable length, and the ephemeral keys related to K2 are reused, then there is an attack that allows you to learn K2. And this is actually based on some earlier classical attacks that involve hash function exploits. There's a protocol called APOP that is used for challenge response, and there was an attack identified by Laurent in the mid-2000s that exploits collisions to recover the secret in this challenge response protocol. And it's not too dissimilar from the crime attack on TLS from a few years ago. So there are scenarios in which hash function concatenation and hashing is not a safe concatenation method in the face of weak hash functions. But it is important to point out very significant assumptions here. Not only does the hash function need to be not collision resistant, but we need long session times and ephemeral key reuse. And in the case of this particular scenario, one assumption is definitely not satisfied. For all of the groups that we're considering, this first key is fixed length. So we don't have the ability for this attack to be carried out because the second condition is not satisfied. However, this is overall a worthwhile exercise. Given the existence of implementations that are going to be probably very long-lived and some of them very hard to upgrade in embedded devices and automobiles and so on, we should ask the question, how robust our protocol designs should be to algorithm failure. And I think there are a lot of careful considerations that need to be given in this space. I have one more thing to say about hybrid or composite algorithms, and this is in the context of authentication. So I mentioned that our work is focused on key exchange, and that that we're not working directly on hybrid certificates or hybrid authentication. But I did want to at least let you know that there is work going on this at the IETF. I'm not involved in this, but there is some work being done in the LAMPS working group by Mike Unsworth, Massimiliano Palo, and others. LAMPS is the IETF's working group on public key infrastructure and secure mail. And they now have several milestones related to post-quantum and composite hybrid excuse me, certificates. And one interesting question that's come up in that context has been, in an asynchronous setting, how should you interpret a credential or a cryptographic object that has two algorithms or two public keys in it? For example, if I gave you a certificate for secure email with two public keys in it, how do I intend for you to use that certificate? Do I intend that both algorithms must be used, that you should only accept a signed email from me if both signatures verify? Or am I trying to do something about backwards compatibility, that I think it's okay if either signature verifies, and it's fine if only one does? So this is something that is an interesting question that came up in their work on developing composite certificates. So that's my discussion about hybrid and composite algorithms. I wanted to switch now to talk a little bit about alternative protocol designs. This is based on joint work with several colleagues in the Netherlands, Peter Schwab and Tom Wiggers, as well as colleagues at Cloudflare, Sophia Selly and Nick Sullivan, trying to investigate some of these alternative protocol designs. So this is coming back to alternative designs for authenticated key exchange, where we have two parties that are trying to establish a shared secret over a public communication channel. Now, there's a vast literature on authenticated key exchange protocols that explore many different varieties of characteristics in a variety of settings. But for the purposes of the rest of this section, I'm going to focus on one distinction, the distinction between explicit and implicit authentication. So explicit authentication, which is what we are most used to, is when one party, Alice, receives assurance that she really is talking to another party, Bob. Right now, on the wire, Alice has direct assurance that she's really talking to Bob. This contrasts with implicit authentication, where Alice is still receiving an authentication assurance, but that assurance is that only Bob would be able to compute the shared secret that Alice has. She has no guarantee that Bob actually is live on the other end of the wire at the moment, but whatever she sends, only Bob would be able to decrypt. So let's take a look at two examples for this. We're familiar with the signed Diffie-Hellman protocol. I gave some examples earlier where we have a Diffie-Hellman key exchange that's used to establish a shared secret, and signatures that are used for authentication based on long-term signature public keys. And authentication comes from a transcript of the communication being signed. This is the standard example of explicitly authenticated key exchange. An alternative in implicitly authenticated key exchange would be to use Diffie-Hellman for both the ephemeral key exchange as well as for a long-term key exchange. In this example here, Alice and Bob both have long-term Diffie-Hellman public keys that might be in certificates, for example. And then when they do their shared secret calculation, they have shared secret components that come both from the ephemeral key exchange, G to the XY, and from the static Diffie-Hellman key exchange, combining one party's public Diffie-Hellman public key with the other party's Diffie-Hellman long-term secret key. So this has the implicit authentication property. At the end of this protocol, both parties know that only their peer, Alice or Bob, should be able to compute the shared secret, but they don't have a guarantee at the end of the protocol here that the other party is actually Alice or Bob at this point in time. that type of assurance like that might come later, but at this point in time, when they accept the session key, they don't have that assurance. So we're going to use this long-standing design idea to try to address a problem in the post-quantum space. And the problem is that post-quantum signatures are big. I showed you some graphs earlier with some sizes on them, and let me remind you of those in a table form here. So compared to our classical algorithms at the top, we see that our lattice-based algorithms, or even some of our other post-quantum algorithms, generally are larger than our classical signature schemes. Some of them exhibit some trade-offs, like the hash-based and multivariate ones, but our lattice-based signatures, for example, have public keys and signatures that are both a fair bit larger than traditional signature schemes. What we're going to do in this work is we're going to use post-quantum KEMs for authentication. Now, I'll tell you the reason for that in a moment, but let me make sure that we're all familiar with KEMs. I've mentioned them a few times, but I haven't actually told you the details of that. KEMs are basically an abstraction of Diffie-Hellman key exchange. We have three algorithms that comprise a KEM, a key generation protocol, an encapsulation, a key generation algorithm, an encapsulation algorithm, and a decapsulation algorithm. And we can use this for key exchange by having one party generate a key pair, a public key and a secret key, transmit the public key to the other party, who runs the encapsulation algorithm against that public key to generate a ciphertext and a key K, transmits the ciphertext back to the first party, who decapsulates and computes the same key K as the other party. So this is really an abstraction or generalization of Diffie-Hellman key exchange. The reason we're interested in KEMs, and the reason that using post-quantum KEMs for authentication might be better, is that post-quantum KEMs, by and large, have smaller communication sizes than post-quantum signature schemes. They're still larger than our traditional key exchange algorithms, but in many cases, they are smaller than post-quantum signature schemes. So when we look at the lattice-based key exchange algorithms, for example, these three lines here, Kyber, Entru, and Saber, we can see that they are generally smaller than the lattice-based signature schemes. And there are post-quantum KEMs that are even smaller than that, the supersingular isogeny-based algorithm Psych. So it may be the case that if we can find a way to use post-quantum KEMs for authentication compared to signatures, we can save communication size. I should be very clear that implicitly authenticated key exchange is not new. There are lots of examples both in the literature and in practice. The point of this work is to investigate what this would mean in the context of TLS 1.3. And we've called this, this mechanism of doing so KEMTLS. So in KEMTLS, we're replacing the TLS 1.3 handshake's signatures with KEMs. So we still have an ephemeral key exchange, and it's going to be based on KEMs, as we might expect. But the server-to-client authentication is going to be based on KEMs rather than signatures. So the server will generate a long-term KEM public key and obtain a certificate for their long-term KEM public key and transmit that to the client. And the client will do a second key exchange, an encapsulation against the server's long-term public key, and transmit that to the server. And then the overall shared secret will be a combination of the ephemeral shared secret and the long-term shared secret. So we have, at the time that the orange key is established, an implicitly authenticated shared secret. So that's the protocol design. When we're trying to realize this in an instantiation, we have several algorithm choices we can make. We have to choose what KEMs we want to use for ephemeral and authenticated key exchange. And we are still going to have signature schemes. Although the server's authentication will be done using a KEM rather than a signature scheme, we still have to have signatures for the certificates. There will be possibly intermediate certificate authorities, as well as a root certificate authority. What's interesting, especially for the signature schemes, is that we can start to make some trade-offs. For example, for the root certificate authorities signature, the public key of the root certificate authority will be built into the client already. It'll be built into the trust store of the browser or the operating system already, so that key will never be transmitted. And that might allow us to trade off small signatures in the root signature scheme for large public keys, since we don't have to transmit the public keys. So we have several parameters or several parameter spaces that we can explore. And we've done some analyses kind of exploring several scenarios, a few scenarios about minimizing size in an absolute way, as well as a few scenarios using families of cryptographic assumptions. So I'll try to briefly show you some of the results from these different scenarios. So this chart here shows on the x-axis the size of public key cryptography objects that are transmitted in KEMTLS versus on the y-axis the time until the client receives encrypted application data. We're ideally going to be as far to the bottom left as possible, small communication and quick computation. Here's an example of what we would achieve with TLS 1.3 when we're using ECDSA for ephemeral key exchange and RSA for server authentication, intermediate certificates authority, and root certificate authority. Okay, let's compare that with a post-quantum scenario. So this blue square on the right-hand side, labeled KDDD, is what happens if we replace signed Diffie-Hellman with signed post-quantum KEMs using Kyber and dilithium, which are a lattice-based family of post-quantum algorithms based on the same assumption. We need about 11.5 kilobytes of communication, and we get fairly good performance. If we replace that with KEMTLS, in other words, we replace server authentication, changing dilithium signatures to Kyber KEMs, you'll see that we can reduce communication sizes by nearly 2 kilobytes. And in fact, slightly decrease computation time as well. That's the most dramatic improvement that KEMTLS brings to communication sizes. When we look at n-true-based assumptions, the improvement is less dramatic, although there is still some improvement. And if our goal is to minimize communication sizes entirely with whatever mix of post-quantum algorithms we can use, we can actually get fairly small communication sizes by using Cyc for key exchange. However, Cyc is a bit slower, so we do see increased communication time. And if we remove intermediate certificate authorities, for example, because they're cached, then we can see even smaller communication sizes. And KEMTLS allows us to approach communication sizes that are nearly as small as the original TLS 1.3 handshakes. So the main benefits that we get from KEMTLS are size optimized communication, allowing for significant reduction in communication size compared to post-quantum signed KEMTLS, and speed improvements on the server side as well. Although we didn't see it in the overall communication sizes, we can actually reduce server load substantially because some post-quantum KEMs are much more efficient on server side than post-quantum signing. And we can do this without the cost of extra round trips, and in fact also by having a smaller trusted code base, since we don't need signature generation on the server side. Now, there are several security analyses that we've done on KEMTLS. We have a pen and paper analysis in the original paper, and we've been developing some formal verification analyses in the last few months as well, using the Tamarind prover. The main security properties that we're trying to prove are that it is a secure multi-stage key exchange protocol. This is extending the model that's been used to analyze TLS 1.3. This means that the session keys should be indistinguishable from random, that there should be forward secrecy properties, and that we have various implicit authentication and explicit authentication properties. I should say there are several subtleties in the definitions of security here. There are subtleties related to exactly what type of implicit and explicit authentication we have at various stages in the protocol, as well as subtleties on the level of forward secrecy received by various keys, because several keys are established with varying forward secrecy properties. There are also some subtleties around downgrade resilience in terms of negotiation of algorithms. So the choice of cryptographic algorithms in KEMTLS isn't actually authenticated at the time that the client sends its first application flow. Now, this doesn't mean that a man in the middle can trick the client into using an undesirable algorithm, but it means they can temporarily trick them into using a suboptimal algorithm for the first application flow. But it will be eventually caught via some key confirmation mechanisms. We also have some variants of KEMTLS. We have a variant of KEMTLS with client authentication, where the client has a long-term public key, and it uses that to authenticate rather than a signature key. In the case of KEMTLS, this preserves client confidentiality and reduces communication size, but it does come at the cost of an extra round trip. So we also have some variants using pre-distributed public keys that eliminate that cost. So if the server's public keys are pre-distributed, and there are several mechanisms that might allow for that, then we can achieve a 1 round trip time TLS 1.3 handshake with implicit authentication. And there are a bunch of details on that in the slides, but I won't have time to go into that. There are lots of other security properties that are worth considering in this context. Anonymity properties, for example, as well as deniability properties. One nice thing about KEMTLS is by not using signatures for authentication, it yields a property called offline deniability, meaning that a judge cannot distinguish honest transcripts from a forgery. And this is similar to what's achieved in the signal handshake. There are stronger versions of deniability called online deniability that are much harder to achieve, and KEMTLS does not achieve it, nor does signal. But at least we get this potentially nice offline deniability property. But as I mentioned, the TLS ecosystem is very complex, and there's lots to consider here. If we wanted to actually use a protocol like this, we do have to change not only implementations to have a new state machine and new messages, but we also have to consider how this affects other parts of the ecosystem. The TLS handshake is used in other protocols like QUIC, so we have to consider what this means for them. There might be application-specific behavior that is sensitive to some of the authentication properties, such as how HTTP3 uses TLS. We'd also have to develop a PKI for KEM public keys, and we'd have to consider how this affects the long tail of implementations and middle boxes. So it would be quite an effort to transition the ecosystem to use this, but it would come with some benefits in reduced communication sizes. So I'll summarize. I've talked a little bit about the path towards transitioning the TLS protocol to post-quantum cryptography in several ways. I gave some details on what hybrid key exchange would look like in TLS 1.3, as well as some alternative protocol designs. And I also very briefly mentioned some prototypes that are available via our Open Quantum Safe project. So that's my talk for today. I'm looking forward to answering your questions. And thanks very much for this opportunity.